Hey, welcome to Energy Matters Live. I'm Tim Echols, and we always want to help you save money on your power bill on our show to live a more sustainable life and to use technology in a wise way. I'm Tim Echols. I'm the host of Energy Matters Live. My co-host, Casey Boyce, and we're going to be talking for this segment about Texas and what's happened in Texas. Casey, any way you look at it, it's a tragedy.
For sure.
I mean, we've got time to figure out what happened. There's a lot of blame going around out there, but right now they just need to fix it. Why don't you tell us how Texas differs from Georgia in terms of the way their energy planning system is set up?
Yeah. And, this is important context to think about when you're thinking about what's happening in Texas. So one of the big issues is that Texas has its own grid, unlike pretty much anywhere else in the country where grids are interconnected. And so why that is an issue is that there are very limited opportunities in Texas to import power from other states. So while, someone in New Mexico might have power, they can't get it across the state line to Texans who need it. So that's one challenge that they're facing. The other piece of Texas's electric market really is worth noting. And while this isn't something that, really is related to the power outages, their market has been deregulated more than any other market in the US. And it's kind of similar to Georgia's natural gas market, Tim, where you've got generators that generate power based on market conditions. You've got monopoly utilities that distribute the power, much like Atlanta Gas Light does here in Georgia for natural gas. And then you've got retail energy providers or retail electric providers that are actually the companies that customers buy their power from. So that's how they're structured. And again, it's not really something that, was a cause of the outages, but certainly makes it an interesting place to watch.
I was asked by several media folks about how Georgia is different. Could this happen in Georgia? What do we have in place to keep it from happening? And Casey, I guess, it is impossible to plan for all risk scenarios, right? I mean, the more you plan for them, the more it costs. And Let me just give you an example. When the pandemic started, every store I went in, I don't know about you, but every store I went in, they were either out of toilet paper or they were rationing it in some way. How about you? Did you experience that?
We did. My wife had the foresight to stock up on toilet paper, so we didn't have issues. But yeah, I saw the same thing that you and everyone else did. A lot of empty shelves.
So one of the things that we've done in energy planning with Georgia Power is we have set a very high reserve margin. And we've been criticized for the reserve margin, Casey, because in order to have plants that are spinning and ready to go and have these additional reserves, you decide not to close this plant. No, we're going to keep it in reserve. It costs money, right? And that gets baked into rates. And in fact, our winter peak reserve, and we essentially upped it in 2019. We upped it to 26%. And I mean, let's just put it in the toilet paper vernacular. So would you expect every grocery store and every drugstore to have a little pod or a semi truck in back of their store with just toilet paper, right? 25% of what they would normally have on the shelf, just in case we have a pandemic, and that toilet paper stays out there no matter what. You don't use it until you are in a toilet paper crisis, right? And so that's essentially what we have done with energy in Georgia. We have 26% extra that people are paying for, and it is put aside for emergencies just like this. And Casey, I don't know that any business school, and certainly not the one you went to at Georgia State, would say, oh yeah, that's a good idea to rent a semi-trailer and stock it full of toilet paper and keep it out there for what, a 100-year event? Are you
Right,
going to
the
leave it out there? It'll
strategic
be
toilet paper reserves. Yeah.
yeah. So, but with energy, we have deemed it so important and so essential to life and health and business and economic development that we have created this substantial reserve margin. And that market in Texas has a much slimmer reserve margin.
Yep.
I guess in part, Casey, when you have a regulated utility like Georgia Power that owns their own generation, they own their own distribution lines, they do everything. So I guess it's easier for them in this scenario to be able to justify that, right? So they've got all of this extra emergency preparedness money. They can do the gold-plated preventive maintenance program, right? They can keep this plant alive and going and staffed, even though we hardly ever use it. But when you're in a market like Texas, and these plants are competing on price, I mean, that makes it harder, doesn't it?
Yeah. So in Texas, another thing that I should clarify here for listeners is that the market just pays for energy. So that's the kilowatt hours or the megawatt hours or whatever. And there are other markets in the US where generators get paid for capacity. So much like you described Georgia Power having generation ready to go if we need it, there are other markets in the US where generation is paid to just be there if it's needed, right? And that's not the case in Texas. And so, there's kind of two things going on here. One is that there's not a lot of an economic incentive to overbuild on generation. You've got to run it. You've got to get paid to make the numbers work. The flip side of it is that, when this cold snap hit and generation started shutting down and people demanded more electricity because, hey, it's cold out and you want to be warm, every generator that could was running because they were getting paid lots and lots of money because the supply versus demand was just that constrained. So this was not a case of power plants sitting there idle, not being used. It was a case of everything that could was running full tilt. And there were some other issues at play here that we'll talk about in a moment.
Yeah, those prices, if you think about our cheap solar out in the field that we pay just about a little over 3 cents per kilowatt. The energy in Texas was up to about 90, wasn't it? What was it going for on Monday?
Yeah, so ERCOT, which is the market operator in Texas, they actually have a price cap at $9,000 a megawatt hour. And so just to put that into perspective, that's about $9 per kilowatt hour, right? And you think about retail rate here in Georgia is about 12 cents per kilowatt hour. So it's way up there.
Wow. 12 cents versus, what did you say? $9?
About $9. Yeah.
Yeah. So everybody was running that could, and it seemed like everything that could go wrong, and they're not, at the time of this recording, they're not out of this yet, Casey, right? You got snow sitting on solar panels. You've got older wind turbines that don't have a de-icing mechanism on the blade. You've got a nuclear power plant that tripped because of a malfunctioning pump. You've got coal plants that supposedly the coal piles had frozen. You've got natural gas that's being restricted from power plants because so many people are using it in their home, right? It was just one thing after another, not to mention possible downed lines, right? Explain the difference between, say, an outage because of a downed line versus an outage because a power plant down the road has been tripped and it's not operating.
Yeah, so with a down line, you literally can't get the power to where it needs to go, right? And that's a lot of what we experience here in Georgia when we have storms come through and things like that, right? And then the power company has to go put the lines back up. And of course, really dangerous conditions for line workers to be doing that in the cold and ice that they're experiencing in Texas. With the power plant tripping, the issue there is that, as we've talked about before, the grid operators have to balance supply and demand in real time. There's no wiggle room there, or very bad things happen, right? And so if the power plant trips offline, then you either need to have another power plant ready to come online, or you need to reduce demand. And what they've had to do in Texas is reduce demand by turning off people's power. And, Tim, you hit the nail on the head here, right? Like, there are a lot of people that are rushing to blame, one generation source or another. And that's not the case. Nobody was prepared for this. And so it was something that was system-wide. It impacted every kind of generation, whether it was renewables, fossil, nuclear in Texas, and it's just a really bad situation all around.
Casey, as I think about my priorities as a regulator, I mean, certainly reliability, and I've said it for 10 years, it's my number one goal. It's more important than it being clean. It's more important than it being cheap. It's more important than reducing CO2. It's having the power when we need it, because at the end of the day or the night, it's the loss of life that's happening out there. Mm-hmm. People freezing to death and having other accidents as they try to heat themselves. So we want to urge everyone to pray for our friends in Texas. It's not an easy thing. We'll do a postmortem on this as we get more information from ERCOT. But I'm Tim Echols. You're listening to Energy Matters. My host, Casey Boyce. He's at Casey Boyce on Twitter. I'm at Tim Echols. The show's at Matters Radio. Thanks for joining us.